I like how I would have lived my life.
Yeah.
Okay, hi
Yeah.
everyone. Welcome, welcome.
And there's
We have folks joining us on Zoom today, and we have a room full of beautiful humans live in the flesh. This is our very first hybrid institute event. Woohoo! And that means there's probably going to be some kinks for us to work out. So thank you for your patience and understanding. Folks joining us on live stream, I'm going to be watching closely to make sure that you can hear and see us as best you can. And we're going to go ahead and jump in. My name is Becky. I think everyone in this room knows me. Many of you on live stream may not know me. I'm the outreach coordinator here at Hilltop Children's Center. And I'm super excited to introduce my colleague, Leah Gotz, who is leading the first part of our summer series on supporting children's sensory development, which is a very important and juicy topic and one that we're always hungry for more information around. So Leah is an early childhood educator teaching 1.5 to 2-year-olds at Hilltop Children's Center and the proud co-parent of a 5-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter. She carries both a personal and professional passion around the topic of sensory development, which she will tell you more about in her training today. Just a few housekeeping items before we jump into our content. So live stream folks, you can access closed captioning by looking for the 3 dots in your menu bar on your Zoom screen. Please remember to keep your mute button on. If you want your camera on, we would love that to just personalize that connection. And there will be breakout sessions today. So our in-person folks, we're going to have you move around the room a little bit for that piece. Live stream folks will put you into breakout groups. And again, any tech issues, just message me directly in the chat. And is there anything else I need to say before we start? I don't think so. I think we're ready. So without further ado, welcome to Leah.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I appreciate that there's an incredible wealth of knowledge in the room and a diversity of experience with early childhood education with different age groups and also the very wide range of children that we teach and their needs. And so my idea about designing today was really looking at, rather than doing a presentation and just giving a bunch of information or looking at data, doing more of a facilitated conversation so that we can all talk about our experiences with sensory seeking children and talk about how we can best support them. So throughout our conversation, I'm going to be hoping for participation and asking for feedback. As was mentioned, we are going to give a big portion of time to being able to look at classroom scenarios that I created along with other educators and with feedback of parents and through experiences that we've had here at Hilltop and other centers that I've worked with, where sensory seeking children provide us with some unique opportunities to sort of stretch ourselves as teachers and really meet them where they're at to make sure that we are responding to their needs. So everybody has packets in front of them on their tables physically, and that you were also sent one electronically. I'll be referring to these, but really my hope is that having some slides will help kind of move us forward, and that this is more of a resource to go back to as you're looking back and maybe thinking about what we've talked about today and wanting to perhaps pull from some of these resources to try things out in your classrooms. So to start out with, one of the things I wanted to lay out as a context or groundwork is that as we all know, there's a real wide range of children and the way that they move through the world and they experience their senses. So for purposes of this workshop, I really focused on sensory seeking children rather than looking at the range that might include children that may have more typical experiences with their senses, or children that have sensory sensitivities. So while those other children are very, very important and have unique preferences and profiles for senses, today we're really going to focus on a particular subset, which is sensory seeking children. As we go through, we'll talk a little bit more about how diverse that group is, even though we're going to be talking about them in some broader strokes in terms of how they experience their senses, some behaviors that they might have, and ways that we can enrich their experience in the classroom. So to start with, we're going to be doing a little bit of background just to get a common vocabulary. So we're going to talk about the 8 senses. We're going to talk about how sensory seeking children experience things through those senses, and maybe some of the common behaviors that we're used to seeing and some of the patterns that we notice in our classrooms. And we're also going to be talking, importantly, about some misperceptions or prejudgments that might happen with kids that are sensory seeking. And that could be coming from ourselves as educators, could be coming from parents, could be coming from, the media. So really kind of checking our biases and sharing those candidly with each other to keep those in mind as we talk about those children as well. We will then move into some small breakout groups, and they're designed to be basically scenarios that are set up based on roughly children's ages. So we have a scenario for 1 to 2 year olds, a scenario for 3-year-olds, one for that 4 to 5-year-old preschool, and then a school age scenario. And the folks in this room will be able to split into groups as they see fit, whether they're interested. It's an area that they're working with kids right now. Maybe they're going to be hoping to work with that age group in the future. And likewise, for the folks that are on our Zoom meetings, we're going to have some virtual breakouts where you can then choose to be in those scenarios. You could talk amongst your educator peers in your small groups. Then we're going to get back together and share with each other the things that we talked about for these scenarios, and ways, some tools, some resources, some things maybe we've tried that have worked, or some questions that we have about how to address the kinds of challenges or behaviors that may be coming up in those scenarios. Then after a short break, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into how we can give some structured sensory stimulation. So what kinds of experiences can we give sensory seeking children that allow them to really express themselves from their natural curiosities, from their natural energy levels, but still allow them to be a happy part of the classroom community, along with different types of sensory seekers that are different from themselves in terms of the way that they move through the world. We're also going to talk briefly about resources and tools in this packet, some of which I think will come up as we move through the workshop, and then take a short time for question and answer. So it's pretty chock full, but the main thing is for us to be able to share with each other the things that we have experienced, and maybe to get some questions answered, or to talk through some challenges that we're having even currently with sensory seeking kiddos. So to start with, we're going to start with what are the 8 senses. When we talk about our senses, I think often folks think about 5 senses rather than 8. For folks in this room, can anybody give me some examples of what senses are that they immediately think about when they think about the 5 or the 8 senses? Sight. Okay, so sight. Smell or olfactory sense. Taste, thank you. So taste and smell are very closely related. Often we experience them together. I just heard another one, touch. So the tactile sense. So those are the ones that we think of that are sort of the most common senses that kind of rise to the surface. Often when we think of sensory kiddos and experience things in a sensory way, we might think of touch or the tactile sense as the most common sense and the one that might show up most in terms of behaviors. So if we want to go to the next slide. So you'll see in your packet and throughout this workshop that I use these icons as a way of sort of drawing us back to the groupings of senses. So as we look at resources and as we look at ways of doing sensory stimulating activities, you'll see these pop up. So we talked about 5, and there are 3 additional senses that we may be aware of as educators, either by their more technical name or just by how we experience them. But can anybody think of any other senses when we talk about sensory interaction? Proprioceptive sense. So proprioception is a way of describing how our bodies interact in the world. So proprioception is how our joints, ligaments, and muscles work together and how we exist in space. And so proprioceptive sense gives us an idea of where our bodies stop and start, which sometimes can be super challenging for sensory seeking children or children that aren't as in tune with their proprioceptive sense. So that's external body awareness is kind of the short notation of how we talk about the proprioceptive system. So there's 2 others that are similar in terms of how we experience things in senses in our bodies. Can anyone offer one? We could go on to the next one. Balance, absolutely. So vestibular system is our balance. So it's our sense of balance and spatial orientation. So it basically gives us a sense of which way is up, which way is down, about whether we're moving in space, so spinning versus standing still. And this is one of those systems that, again, sensory seeking kids will often be experimenting with. And that as we talk about the kinds of activities that they enjoy, a lot of them will be working with the vestibular system. And you may have this phrase as something that you're familiar with because our vestibular system, our inner ear, also helps with balance. So that's why when we're on a plane, for instance, sometimes we're very disoriented in terms of our balance because our vestibular system has been blocked or plugged by the change of air pressure. So our final one is our interoceptive system. So interoception is that internal body sense. So it's what's going on inside our bodies. So it's our ability to know whether we're hungry, whether we're thirsty, whether we're tired, whether we need to use the bathroom. So these are things that are developing over time in all children, not just sensory seeking children, but with kids that are sensory seeking children, their interoceptive senses might be developing a little bit differently. And they may have a little bit of a harder time identifying what's going on within their body. So they might not be able to see the cues that I'm sweaty or I'm flushing or my face is getting hot. And this might mean that I'm also getting thirsty or I'm getting tired or my temperature is changing. So this is another one of our 8 senses that are all affected by the way we move through the world and the way that we experience things through our senses. So does this bring up any questions, the 8 senses that we just talked about? Yes. That is a really good question. The question is, at what age do children or adults become more aware of their interoceptive needs? And I think that there's a range. I'm looking to my colleague and someone that was a great content contributor to my Nico, who's in the audience here. And what I would say is that it's going to differ. We see, for instance, toilet learning being, as young as 2 in some cases, but it could be that a 5 or a 6-year-old isn't able to recognize toileting cues yet. Anybody that as an adult sometimes misses their own cues for hunger and thirst, hangry, does that sound familiar? Anybody that's worked with me that knows what's going on when I haven't had a snack? So I'm only half joking, that I think that can be something that into adulthood we still work on. I think that for most children, our early childhood work is that we begin to see more children as they hit into preschool and kindergarten able to identify and then maybe interact with us and say, I need my water bottle, or I'm getting hungry, or knowing when it's snack time. So I think that's one of those pre-kindergarten skills, or even into elementary school, that most kids that have what we might think of a more typical experiences with interoception, they're able to pick up on those cues and then make better choices. Not the best, not always, but make better choices then about stopping, using bathroom, asking for water and food. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
But I do think that that's something to look at with individual kiddos. And we could talk more as we go on about the fact that sensory profiles, so a child's ability to experience things with their senses, and for instance, interoceptive sense, you may have a child that has less sense of themselves internally, but a better sense of what's going on in their body externally in terms of coordination and proximity to other people and light or heavy touch. So you could also see a combination of things that is different depending on the kid. So let's move forward a little bit unless there's other questions. Oh, and this is exactly what I was just mentioning, that I think that sometimes we may be surprised at the complexity and the uniqueness and the wonder sort of that we get from our sensory seeking kiddos, because we may have a child that can be, on the one hand, more empathetic and socially emotionally tuned in and maybe sensitive to something like sound. But then on the other hand, physically may not be as aware of where their body is in space, might really love changing speeds, changing whether they're up and down, spinning, constantly moving, balancing. So within that same child, they might even have a sensory sensitivity or being very attuned, and then also have a sensory seeking behavior. And I'm kind of nodding and smiling at my colleague because we have a child in our classroom here at Hilltop that fits that exact profile that we've had to tease out and been a little bit, I think, surprised by and learned from, because of that that diversity of different sensory experiences. So let's talk a little bit about common characteristics of sensory seeking children. So if you think in your mind about those amazing faces that you see every morning and the children that you may have in your class this year, last year, maybe you see on the playground, if you're thinking about sensory seeking children, what are they doing, or what are they interested in? What excites them? What are some characteristics? Yes. Okay.
But it just reminded me that, you still continue to explore the world with your mouth, even at an age where you don't see it that frequently. They're still doing it from time to time. These are kids who've been out there with wood chips 100 times. And they've probably tasted it 100 times. They're still
Yeah. Yeah, or 1,000 times. And so this is also going back to the question, previously about ages and stages, that it's not necessarily something that strictly speaking is, okay, a sensory seeking kiddo at 2 to 3 is going to have more interest in terms of their oral sensation and smell and touch and taste. So really liking to put things in their mouth, taste it, texture. So there's a tactile bit there, even when it's with the tongue. What other are common characteristics of maybe sensory seeking kids when we think about them?
They like to keep tightly or
Absolutely. So getting a lot of that interaction with the proprioceptive senses, getting a lot of feedback to those muscles and ligaments and joints. So compression, and we could talk about that a little bit with sensory stimulating activities. So even things like being squashed. There's also some things that I see as related to that, which could be, do you have kiddos that crash into things? Love a good crash into a pillow. Love to be between pillows. Love to be in a small space. Super tight huggers.
and he said moving the brush with paint from the paper onto the skin, putting the hands and wanting to rub it up the arms.
Absolutely. So that incorporates a number of different senses. This is very, rich for our visual senses and how it feels. And this is not only the texture of the paint, but it's the brush itself. Is it cold? Is it warm? Does it make a sound when I squish it together? So there's all of these different senses that happen from that one experience. What about how they move through space? What about if you're on a playground? What do these sensory seeking kiddos might look like? Say more.
They're the thrill seekers. The kids, they're gonna maybe unsafely launch themselves off of a climber or take off across the playground sometime. They love to chase. They, will experiment with getting in a bowl of water.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to repeat a little bit of that. So these are, I love the first phrase, adrenaline junkies. So these are kiddos that like to experiment with their bodies in space, and it could be not only risky play, but even play that we know and we see and we've worked with them that might be a little bit unsafe. So it's fast running. It's a little bit of impulsive movement. How about climbing? Do you have bookshelf climbers? I know that I've had those in my classes. Kiddos that like to submerge their body in water, like to, it could also be sort of fine movement too. So these might be children that love to pick up and squash every pea that they have in their lunch, or the running your hand against, I love a good corrugated metal wall myself, bump, 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 bump. So it's the sound, it's the feeling, there's all of the senses coming together in some of these movements. Along with that, some other things that I'll add is that sensory seeking kiddos might be kids that you see doing more spinning, might be kids that love to hang upside down, like to balance until they fall over, or really experience being high up and jumping off things and crashing. So again, it's related to that, a little bit of adrenaline, a little bit of risk taking, but also playing with that, the vestibular senses, which way is up, which way is down. Anything else that we could think of that are sort of common? Yes.
Vocalizing, making noise by hitting stuff, anything that will they'll feel in their body and then also hear back through hearing.
That's a really great point. So that is a combination of a very physical stimulation. Okay, so it's a vibration that they might feel, but also just being able to hear their own voice. Kids that hum themselves to sleep, kids that talk to themselves a lot. I hear some chuckles, so we know who those kids are. Kids that like to tap with their feet, with their hands, with their water bottle, that drum on everything, that like to shake things. So a lot of sound, but also a lot of how sound and vibration comes through their bodies is another one of those characteristics. So if we move on from some of these characteristics as we go through, we're going to talk more about these characteristics as we talk about our scenarios, and as we also talk about ways to give the sensory feedback in a positive way that works for groups of children in our care environments, and that also is grounding. So not all sensory stimulation is created equal. So it's time and place, as well as the content of sensory stimulation that we're offering. But some stimulation will in fact make kids feel less grounded and less able to regulate emotions and regulate how they're moving through their environment than others. So I'll give you an example of the first thing I said, time and place, and that's all created equal. The child that loves that tambourine, probably not before nap time. Probably not instruments at lunch. Because as silly as that sounds, that might be the thing that child is seeking out and that they really, really want, and they really are identifying with, that they feel they need in that moment. But we're trying to give them something that may give them some of that vibration, some of that stimulation, some of that rhythmic grounding, but maybe it's a different kind of activity. Maybe it's the ambient music we play. And maybe it's connected with some other things we adjust in our environment to have them get some of that sound, but also have the light stimming. Also make sure that they're getting the food that is nice and grounding for them. Those kids that have gotten particularly hungry and thirsty, and making sure that internally they're feeling grounded. So they won't necessarily need to do as much of the loud sound making that won't help them with moving into nap. The second thing I mentioned was that there are things that kids might gravitate towards that we want to give them opportunities to do in different ways that are safer and that are more, give them a little bit more positive interaction and a little bit more opportunity to be in a group without distracting. So if a child is going to paint all over themselves, how do we give them that opportunity on the playground? How do we give them plenty of space so their friend that either just isn't too interested in it today, or their friend that really is opposed to having that brush on their body, doesn't have an experience that is not positive for them, when for the sensory seeking kiddo, it is positive. And what are items that in our classrooms don't really work with, what we want to give our sensory seeking kids? What are the noise making toys or the items that are easily put in mouths? I mean, there are some things that we're going to have to boundary for sensory seeking kids, especially younger ones, to help them be safe, but have them have their needs fulfilled. So looking at the next piece of this is really constantly looking with that lens of sensory seeking kiddos in community. Okay. And we're all sensory beings in community together with our children. So it's important that we teach all of our children to notice and name what they're experiencing outside their bodies and inside their bodies, so they can then communicate their needs and their wants, their curiosities, the things they're excited about, the things they want to show us and share with us, in positive ways. So a lot of things that we're going to talk about today, not just for the sensory seeking kiddos, it's for all of our children, but what it might look like is going to be different, maybe unique and different child to child, person to person, okay? But the idea that notice and naming sensations for all children is part of our job, if you will, of teaching them these things, modeling these for them, okay? And then this leads into the fact that the more we give children tools to recognize what they need and want and how they're moving through the world and their ability to communicate, maybe not with words, maybe with pictures, maybe with signs, maybe with motions, communicate their needs, then the more they can make those good choices instead of displaying challenging behaviors. So the next piece we're going to talk about is those challenging behaviors. So when we think about sensory seeking children, and we're very candid and very honest, and this is a safe space to share, I think that there are some things that are stereotypes or things that we commonly think of. And often they're rooted in some truths about how we see children moving through the world that are sensory seekers. So what are some things that we think of as common stereotypes? You can look here or you can just think about it in your mind. But we're going to go there in a minute. So what are some common things that we think about when we think of sensory seeking kiddos?
They're bullies.
They're bullies. They're mean. They're mean. And when you say bullies, bullies implies towards other children. Okay? So they're physical and they're mean and they're, yes.
Just tell them enough times, they'll stop seeking sensory.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We just have to be clear. Give them their clear instructions, right? We just have to give them those instructions and be clear, set those boundaries, and then they're going to stop that behavior. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. Disruptive. They're doing something that seems to be very different than everybody else, and they might be doing that 100 times a day, 1,000 times a day, different than everybody else. Yeah. They struggle with boundaries. So those boundaries, tell me more about what kinds of boundaries you're thinking of. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just repeat this for folks that are on the Zoom. So kids that struggle with boundaries, and particularly around physical boundaries. And so we're teaching about asking for permission and having body autonomy and getting consent. And these are big themes that we're trying to impart and model for our children. And there might be those kiddos that just will not ask. They love to touch hair. They love to touch faces. They love to touch body parts. So these sensory seeking kids might not have any boundaries. Other things that we think of. Yes. Yep, that they're out of control. So that could be physically. It could be emotionally, they're out of control. They don't self-regulate. They don't listen to instructions. Even though we tell them many times and we think that we can change them by telling them, they don't listen to instructions. Another, yes.
Other side of that, like they are intentionally finding ways to be aggressive or get their needs met, but they probably don't even know what their needs are when they're doing that.
So a colleague just mentioned intentionality. So we see kiddos' behaviors, and sometimes it's tempting to think they know what they're doing. They're doing it on purpose. They're doing it intentionally. Why don't they just stop touching her? You know, why doesn't this child just stop, making that sound, because they must know that it's disruptive to everybody else.
Blaming it on the parenting or the way that they were raised.
Okay, I think this is a really important and really subtle thing sometimes, and for us as educators, that to say, why don't the parents set boundaries, right? Do the parents let them get away with that? One way that I've heard it, or I mean, I've thought these things, I've had these impulses, they're so spoiled. Does this kid always, like, they could just eat off the floor? Like, what's happening here? Like, you're running around without your diaper? You're this crazy behavior, you're just jumping off things headlong. Like, that the idea that, again, if they just had better boundaries at home, if they had more structure, if they weren't so spoiled. So these are all things, and yes.
Or maybe they did not get that kind of attention with their parents, so they want to seek it at some place by doing this.
Absolutely. So this is a great sort of subtle layer as well, that this is attention seeking. So it may be intentional to get attention, and we're wondering if they're kind of compensating because they're not getting the attention that they need at home, or they're not getting the attention that they need at school. And a lot of these kind of intertwine and are interrelated. So the reason why I decided to include this is because I think that there are so many things that naturally become sort of stereotypical and sort of this black and white picture about who sensory seeking children are. And in going into these stereotypes, first of all, some of it is just incorrect and lack of understanding and lack of knowledge, and not really grounded in the data or science about what sensory seeking kids, who they are and what they do. And then the other piece is it's not really meeting them where they're at, and it's not going to be successful. So when behaviors are coming from children who are seeking sensory experiences because of the way that they experience the world, and because those experiences are grounding, they're not doing it on purpose to make it harder for us. They're not doing it on purpose to hurt their friends. They're not doing it on purpose because they are acting out. They are giving us information about their needs, and they're using the tools they have and the way that they experience the world to do painting, to get their needs met because they're thirsty or hungry, to get a hug. So that's why we then move into, okay, so what can we do as caring adults to try and give them experiences that work for them? Oh, so anything to add that we didn't touch on here? Yes, and that is actually a piece of, in the back of the room, someone said they need meditation. Medication. Oh, sorry. Yes, misconception. We can medicate it out. Yes, absolutely. So I do want to say that I'll talk about the last bullet, and then I want to touch on the medication piece for just a second. The last bullet, they can learn to change their sensory needs, is maybe a high-level thesis statement that I have about the biggest misperceptions about children, is that we can help them respond to their needs, just like we as adults have learned about our own needs and what we need to do to make sure we have a snack in the car, to make sure that we have extra layers if we get cold, to make sure we don't agree to do things at work that don't work with our skill set, our comfortability, our culture, our personal needs, the things we've learned as adults. This is what our work is with these children, to help them learn how to meet their needs, but we're not going to change them. We're not going to change them. And I will get back to this piece about medication, because I want to refer to something that you can look at the back. In a training I took, I love the analogy of different size cups. So if we think about our sensory needs and we think about them in terms of filling a cup with what we experience through our different senses, some people have smaller cups than others. Some people are going to have a small cup that gets filled up very quickly for things like sound. There might be people in this room that say, you know, a little bit of sound goes a long way for me. Bring my headphones. I like loud music, but I don't want it to be too loud. I like being able to turn music down. Don't like loud bars or restaurants where there's a lot of ambient noise. My cup for sound is small. You might think to yourself, okay, as an adult. You might be a more average size cup. Sometimes background noise is fine. Sometimes I don't like it. If the music is louder, but it's music I like, that's fine. And then some people might think to themselves, bring it on. When I come home, one of the first things I want to do is I have my sound set up in different rooms, and I'm immediately playing music, and I like different types of music or different types of sound, and I've got it going, and I like a higher volume. So if my cup is bigger for sensory and specifically for sound, then it might take more to fill me up. So that idea of your cup being different sizes is a good reminder for, we may have a bigger cup for some things, smaller cup for others, same thing with children. And also the idea that children aren't going to change their cup. We can't change their cup. We can't simply say, you know, it would be a lot better if you were just, you know, you didn't need to run around so much. You know, all this squishing and squashing and hugging and touching, you know, you'd do a lot better if you didn't need that. Well, that's who they are. So what we're going to do is talk about ways that they can get that in a way that works in the different communities and environments that they're in. So the other piece I'm going to mention is that in the back of your packet, on page 10, and I always think it's interesting because there's part of the room that always has to go there right away, and the other part of the room that's like, I'm not going there right now because I know I'm never coming out if I come there. So again, it's just different people experience things different ways. Page 10, there are facts about sensory processing. And some of those facts that I found really interesting are about misperceptions about sensory seeking children, and specifically about coexisting conditions and whether or not the stereotype of the ADHD or the person that might be on the autism spectrum is necessarily sensory seeking. So I thought it would be interesting to give that kind of data reference from folks there, because the idea of let's just medicate it, or if a child is sensory seeking, they must also have, you know, some other things going on that they may benefit from medication. What I would say is take a look at those facts and make sure that you're teasing out and challenging your own perceptions and stereotypes about children that are sensory seeking, other things that they might also experience, and sort of how that works with some of the go-tos that we hear a lot about, like assessment, like medication, et cetera. Okay, I won't say too much about that, but I found it interesting, so I wanted to include it. Okay, so questions before we go out to our breakouts? Yes.
Just about the cup thing, one thing that I'm thinking about, like, just for my own life, is that, like, outside forces, like, not a person, but like outside like situations can sometimes change my cup size for like the day. So like some days I'm like, yeah, loud music is fine, and then like and then later I'm like, no, it's not. And I think that's definitely the same thing for kids. And so just like knowing that even though they have a general go-to, like, you know, if something doesn't work one time, it's like,
yep,
this is never going to work again.
Yeah. No, I think that this is, I'm going to repeat it because I think that this is so important. I'm so glad you mentioned that. just like we would not want someone to assume that we need the same food at the same time of day, or that we want the same exact thing to see on the wall every moment of our lives, or we are interested in loud music because we were interested in loud music or liked it last week, or didn't like it last week, doesn't mean we're not going to like it today. The same thing is true with our children. And absolutely, I think that's the case. Again, this goes back to, let's not make assumptions about the needs or wants. And we can model and we can practice that, giving kids some autonomy, giving them the ability to say yes or no by modeling those things. We have kids that love, love, love big hugs, squashing, wrestling, that may not want one day. So that open-handed, did you want a hug? Do you want to play wrestle? Should we do the train with the pillows today? Because maybe that's not what they're feeling. And for us to make that assumption about them is the same way we would feel if the reverse happened and someone made the assumption about us. So that's very, very important, because I think that kids that had sort of more pronounced manifestations of their sensory seeking are kids that sometimes we go there with them right away and we assume what their needs or wants are. Okay, so the breakout groups that we're going to go into are the scenarios that are in your packets, starting on page 19. And the way that we have structured these is that the youngest children, or youngest child, I should say, in a scenario is the first scenario. So the first scenario is a child that's in that 1 to 2 range. Scenario 2 is a 3-year-old. Scenario 3 on page 21 is a preschooler. And scenario 4 is a school age. So what I wanted to do at this point was to invite folks that are physically in this room to move into groups, either where their interest lies today or where they're teaching, that want to talk about these scenarios. So why don't we do a little, is this clockwise? Clockwise. And so this table right here, I would invite people that work with younger children or are interested in that scenario, scenario number 1. Scenario number 2 will be here where my colleague Rebecca's sitting. Scenario number 3 is in the back of this room where Django's sitting. And scenario number 4 is where Lydia is sitting. So if you want to break into those groups, my thought is that you take about 15 minutes to read through the scenario, chat amongst yourselves, and make some notes, because the idea would be when we come back together at a group, it would be read out loud, and then you can share a few things, including questions, but certainly ideas or resources or tools that you think could work in this particular scenario. Does that make sense? Okay. And then folks that are in our live stream will be breaking up into groups that Becky will help you move into. So we're going to take about 10 minutes to chat, look at this scenario. The other thing that's fair game is if you've been finding that there's something happening in a classroom or with particular children that you work with that you're finding challenging and you want to put it out to the group and say, hey, we'd like some creative ideas about this. We could mix it up and you could put that out there instead.
About what is hurtful and what is not.
You know what? I don't think I have, but I don't remember.
Right here.
So I want to thank you. Okay, let me, oh, you know what I did? I did, because now I remember I did them both at the same time. So good, yeah. Back. We're going to get started. So we're going to be able to now hear from each other about the scenarios that we talked about, see what questions came up, ideas came up that were generated, and then also if there are other scenarios or things that you wanted to put out to the group that you're curious about getting some feedback on, now would be a great time as well. So I think we're going to start and just follow the pattern of starting with our youngest scenario, our scenario number 1 again. And as I mentioned earlier, that is on page 19. So if you're a learner that likes to read along and see it for yourself as you're hearing it, it would be on page 19 and then goes from there. There's also a small place to take some notes of things that you hear that is exciting that your peers are sharing. But I will ask if we could have someone from each group read it in a nice clear voice. So those of us that like to hear things as we think them through as well can do that too.
Actually give everyone mics.
Excellent. Okay, so from our group for
Whenever you're
scenario number
talking,
1,
please talk.
if there's someone that's willing to read the scenario.
This is Nico. I can read the scenario for scenario 1. Owen is a sweet and curious 1.5-year-old. He loves music and making noise. He makes sounds by humming, singing, shouting, playing instruments, and banging objects. During lunch, he often taps his metal water bottle the whole time. At nap time, he can only fall asleep if he is talking loudly to himself, which makes it almost impossible to settle the class down. How can we get him to understand when it is time to be quiet? I didn't do
Are we just sharing what we came up with?
Yep. So as a group, if you want to have somebody kind of represent a bit of the thoughts and then you can add on.
Some of the ideas that we came up with based on what happens in current classrooms is the opportunity to front load the sensory input of sound. So one of the things that a classroom does is at the beginning of nap time, they sing a song together as a class. So it's a little bit more organized and the sound is organized, but everyone is still able to share and get out their sensory input for making noise. We also wondered for the banging objects if that is a vibration tactile thing or if it is more sound. If it was more tactile and physical, we thought of showing them how to rub their blanket in both directions for the vibration feeling of the different directions of fabric goes. And then for making noises, we talked about practicing in other parts of the day that are not just at nap time, that you can practice a whisper and loud voices. So seeing how loud we can yell this word, let's now try whispering. How quiet can we whisper? And then just referencing when we whisper, that's the noise we'll use at nap time. Different things like that.
Excellent. Some great suggestions. Other things that came up for folks hearing this scenario that maybe you've tried moving into nap time?
I'll share something else. I think
Another thing that we talked about a little bit was like pointing out other sounds, like pointing out the music that is already playing, or like if you hear a baby crying in another room, just pointing out the other sounds, and then also checking your teacher biases, because sometimes you think it's bothering everyone, but really it's just bothering you. And yeah, just keeping that in mind.
Excellent. I think that covers a lot of different ways of incorporating sound, but also not forgetting that sometimes there's layered in senses that children are trying to go for. Something else that we've seen in our classroom is having children get a little bit of independence and autonomy by mirroring things that we do to help them settle. So doing some chest tapping, which is both a sound and also a feeling and a vibration, And we've seen that children sometimes have started to do that to themselves. I've also seen children playing nap time with each other and actually tapping on each other's chests. And so knowing that doing that practice and also using different voices and recognizing that different voices are appropriate at different times doesn't completely shut down that impulse, but it gives it more of that focus. And I think those are all great suggestions that can be translated into different age groups too. Thank you so much. So let's move on to the second group in scenario number 2, if someone can read it out loud.
Gina is a gregarious and sociable 3-year-old with a ton of energy. She is very physical with friends, and her play often turns into pushing, tackling, or even smacking other children. The more she pursues physical interaction from friends, the more they run from her. How do we manage Gina's needs for big body play and the boundaries of her classmates? So one of the things that comes up in some of our classrooms, solutions that we have for children that have those needs, is to use weighted stuffies or weighted balls so they can push around. One of the ideas that Keely brought up from a previous year was to put kids in boxes or on blankets so that they can push each other and pull each other. So it addresses those social needs and the sensory needs. And we also talked about using a body sock. So kids that need that to be caged a little bit, they can use that. Pushing, dragging, offering adult hands for when kids are tired, offering that adult push and pull. And we've also discovered some challenges when we bring that up because adults, like Mindy was saying, don't always want that and aren't. We're also setting boundaries with children and we're helping them set boundaries with other children. So sometimes we're okay with it and sometimes we're not. So how do we offset that when that happens? Yeah, wrestling, setting visual setups with pillows. This is an area for wrestling. You can wrestle here. Making sure they know the ways to be safe while wrestling, checking in with their bodies, all such things. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This also brings up to me the importance of sharing with parents things that we're doing in our classroom and why we're doing them. So when we're really responding to those proprioceptive needs of some of our sensory seeking children, or in general, kids that are social, that want to interact with others, that might, see from kids that are seeking out wrestling, that wrestling is fun, and that, having pushing, having squashing is something that they want to experiment with. Being able to talk about why big physical play and what might look like aggressive play is in fact a different way of connecting and can be done in a safe way and can be done with boundaries and with permission and asking for consent. And I've seen some wonderful learning stories done by my fellow educators here at Hilltop about sharing that and sharing why it's important to give kids different outlets and how it can be that what might appear to be aggressive play, what might appear to be bullying, or might appear to be sort of intentionally hurting others, is actually this desire for connection that if we guide it, can be a really positive experience for a whole range of kids. So I just wanted to put in that plug too, that remember in documentation, and then when you're talking through choices with kids, to talk about the consent piece, and also to share with families the kinds of skills that you're teaching and why you're teaching them around sensory seeking kids and physical play. Thank you very much. Group number 3, can somebody read the scenario?
Oh, we're supposed to use the microphone. Okay, okay. all right. Ming is a 4-year-old preschooler. When she's engaging in an activity alone, she can be very calm and attentive. However, after her focus wanders, she will run around or throw her toys so high they hit the ceiling. This disrupts the activities of other kids and sometimes breaks or damages classroom materials. So, how can we help her recognize when she's going to need a brain break and to find safer physical outlets? Please jump in here in case I miss anything. So, we talked about expressing trust in these circumstances. Oh, sorry, forgot I was even holding it. We talked about expressing trust in these circumstances. When this happens, it's hard to trust you to take care of these materials. Michelle brought up a great point about front loading with the kids, reminding of what happened last time and what the plan can be moving forward. We talked a lot about systems for consistency and predictability while limiting guilt and shame from the conversation. And kind of growing into your voice. We talked a little bit about like authoritative voice versus like getting a little bit too firm. And we talked, one of the great things that Michelle said I really liked was that, hey, if something's happening like this, or if the child maybe is even doing something to you that you don't like, that it's, it's okay to say, hey, I'm your friend and you're my friend, right? But I don't want to be around you right now, or I'm going to go over here and play with someone else. So just that accountability piece. So when you're talking about setting boundaries, it's also saying what a boundary is. And I thought that was a really clear way of doing it. It's something that we like to use with our group of kiddos as well. And talking about a system, one that I like to use with the kiddos is talking about creating a promise and a plan and what that kind of sounds like. And sometimes I use anecdotes. I like to try to weave it into the storytelling that we do with the kids as well. Yeah, I think that's. Did you have anything else? No. I guess not. Okay. All right.
So I'm really struck by what I'm hearing in terms of some similar themes, but very different in terms of developmental levels, and introducing language that really allows for thinking through sort of action and consequences, and making sure that it's that foundation of trust and having that those shared expectations, which you can use for any age group of children in terms of classroom rules and how we treat each other's bodies, how we treat materials, but then also really having those conversations at a little bit of a more complex level with children that are older, especially children where you see a pattern and they can even perhaps see a pattern. Because in this scenario, one of the key things I think was to help children recognize before they move into being unregulated. So how can we help older children to recognize before they need a brain break, before they've been focused for too long, or before they're missing out on participating in transitions or understanding what the next piece of the structure or the day is. So I really loved a lot of the positive language that you used, and really starting out with that assuming good intent. So that goes back to some of those prejudgments that we were talking about earlier. And with our sensory seeking children, assuming that they want to connect, assuming that they want to have positive, happy, playful interactions with you and with their peers, rather than looking at it as trying to get out of ahead of a conflict. So thank you so much. That was really rich in terms of like all of these different ways that you can layer in that support for the sensory seeking kid, but also things that work for all children in terms of setting up ways to play. Let's go to scenario number 4, please.
Sure. Okay. Fernando is an athletic and sensitive 8-year-old who loves sports. He enjoys initiating physical games with his peers, such as throwing or kicking a ball. These activities often evolve into wrestling and can quickly escalate into altercations, where a teacher must physically separate him and the other child. How can we support Fernando's talents and interests in sports so he can have fun and experience positive interactions with friends?
So a big piece of what we talked about for Fernando is identifying what the need is here. And so we examine like if he has a need for connection and he's trying to just make friends with these students that he doesn't know. He doesn't have the vocabulary or the skills to say, you're someone who I want to be friends with, so I'm going to jump on you and be all up in your business. Instead of that, you can facilitate instances where we all learn the rules of the game, where we become referees who have a better understanding of this game, and then we can explain it to each other, and we can go into like a mentor role where we can explain these games with these specific rules that we have to keep each other safe. And that way you're creating these opportunities for connection in like a really intentional way, so the students know why this wrestling activity is like potentially unsafe, but then also, you know, but also if it was like he needed to just be super physical, creating those opportunities to push or kick something, and then also learn how that affects his body. Am I forgetting anything else that we talked about? Oh yeah, it could also be like a social dynamic of needing to feel like powerful because you're not feeling powerful or seen in other situations. So then like that mentor thing where you're teaching a younger student potentially how to play this game and what the rules are. So there's still kind of a little dynamic where you feel like you're, you know, powerful and you know things, but it's not a physical power dynamic where you're potentially hurting someone.
So I think that these all scaffold really well in terms of if we're looking at different ages and developmental stages. But again, I mean, I heard some great thesis statements that I think apply to all children. So the question that we can ask ourselves and ask children in different ways, depending on the individual child and their age, is, you know, what do you need? What can I help you with? What are you telling me? You know, what do you want right now? Because the behavior is communication. And so if all behavior is a message that's trying to get us to understand the need, the child might not be able to identify it. They might not be able to verbalize it, especially with younger children or kids that are really dysregulated. But the more we can help kids to think that through, then we can help them go in the direction to get that need met. Another thing that I heard that I think is a great idea that can apply to a lot of different age ranges is having different children take different roles and using some of the energy and the interest that a child has, for instance, in sports and in initiating sports or physical activity, that they might take the role of being, you know, kind of a captain or a leader, and they can start a game. You know, can we invite your friends to play? Maybe we can go around and I can go with you, and next time you could do it alone, and maybe we can get 3 other friends that you can invite to play. So you're acknowledging and inviting and saying, it's a great idea to want to play with your friends. How do we do that? So you identify that need, then you give them some skills to be able to meet that need, and then do that coaching, do that mentoring as you go through. But it's also not assuming that we know what the need is. So not assuming that we know that the need is purely physical, or not assuming that we know that the need is wanting to connect, because it could potentially be that the child's really frustrated. Could be that the child needs to go to the bathroom, or that is hungry, or wants to play, wants your attention as the caring adult, that they want to play with you one-on-one. So not making those assumptions, giving them language, having them take on different roles. But again, it's all layered in with what are the expectations? You know, how do we play safe? And there are those things that we can work on together, and then the things that are boundaries that are set that we're not going to move from. So these were really, really rich responses to these scenarios. Jumping off this, we just have a few more minutes, but what about things that may be happening in classrooms that you're not quite sure how to work with? Are there any things happening right now that maybe have been more challenging that you haven't quite gotten your hands around that you might want to throw out to the group? Rebecca, and then we'll go to Michelle.
It's just about nap time, and one of the children is super keyed up and just wants to run in a circle. Like move his body physically in a circle real fast.
Okay.
This child will then sleep once they get on a nap mat. But in the interim, they just want to run in a circle.
Okay. I want to ask just a clarifying question. So what is, I can imagine, but what is the sort of effect that has in the classroom? Like, what do you?
Other children are then real tempted to run in a big circle also.
Okay, so this becomes something
Yeah.
that kids, I mean, I was assuming, but I wanted to make sure.
Right.
So ideas for people that have kids that need that physical burst right before nap time? Andrew, did you have an idea?
Could be a moment where you do like the hokey pokey or something that's like more structured that has a definitive end. That then, like, once we're done with this activity, we're all going to lay down. We're all going to do this thing, and now we're all going to go lay down on our nap mats. And we're going to move on to like the next thing, but make that like a pretty clear transition instead of it being a moment of like unstructured play, like recognizing that need and like incorporating it in for everybody. Yeah, if there's space in the schedule for that.
And noticed that I can talk loud though.
I'll repeat it.
I noticed that I had either too much time in the transition, so I had to shorten that transition, or I've also staggered the class, so like part of them comes in and eats and actually gets things done before the other group. So it's not like this overstimulating transition. So those are two of the things that I've used with older kids, like preschool, pre-K, but not younger ones. I don't know if that would.
I think that what I'm hearing from your recommendation, Michelle, that I'm really glad you brought up, is that look at our environments. So if we have kids that are getting overstimulated, if we have kids that are very, very tempted to pull out toys and dig through them, if they're sleeping right next to the toys, boy, that's going to be really hard not to do. Anybody that scrolls on their phone when they should be going to sleep as an adult, let's take those temptations out. How does that work? How does that energy work? Having different subgroups of kids that are doing activities, having an activity that, as Andrew mentioned, that's a physical activity, but that's a more contained activity. I wonder about, are there other kinds of physical outlets that maybe that child can even do on their mat that will give them sort of a repetition and a way of moving their body? How many times can they reach up and touch their toes? I don't know if that's the movement, but the idea of something very specifically that they can do. And if they can do that and do it 40 times or whatever seems like a ginormous number that they might, that gives them that, but again, they're contained. You start to look at the question of how does it affect other kids? How do we give them the physical outlet, but then how is it also going to work with the tone and the energy level of the rest of the class? Other questions? Did you have something that you're kind of wrangling with?
Something that's challenging in my class is a child who can very quickly go from 0 to 60, and I can't always get in front of it. So usually I can predict things pretty well, but in this situation, it can get explosive very quickly with not necessarily something that you can pinpoint creating the problem.
Triggers are not obvious.
Right. And so I am struggling to try to figure out how to get in front of it and cut it off before it happens, but I'm no quick.
Okay. Questions that we might have about this that could tease this out a little bit? I had a few questions, but questions or ideas?
Yeah, my question was, is the 0 to 60 like out the behavior, I guess? Is it physical? Is it like making a lot of sound?
It's physical.
Physical.
It can be dangerous for the child and other people or living things or things that aren't living. Anything that's just in the way. And that's why I feel like I really need to get in front of it, because it can be dangerous.
And it sounds like you're looking at, precipitating events, anything that might be causing it. Any idea if there's a pattern in terms of the time of day? Or if so, there's
No.
nothing you can, that would be nice to be able to see it.
Yeah, I've been tracking data,
Yep.
trying to say like extra snacks, what kind of foods, regulation, bathroom, temperature.
Yeah.
Definitely there's a connection with transition, but it's more than that.
Yep.
It's all over the place. And so I haven't really been able to figure out what's going on when usually I have by this point in the year.
Yep.
And luckily I'm getting help from a specialist who's helping the family. So there may be a little bit of a light here at the end of it.
One thing that occurs to me is wondering about if there's any awareness on the part of the child about the difference in their behavior, the difference in how they're experiencing things, and starting with the positive, and starting with what I know you guys do is as awesome educators, acknowledging what's working well, and really seeing, I'm noticing that you got your shoes on, and that you're one of the first friends to be ready to go outside. And so getting in front of it in terms of that piece of like trying to figure out when it doesn't happen, what might be present, and having the child be very connected to the positive. I'd love for you to be a line leader, because I see that you have your shoes on, and if you get your coat, that you'll be ready to go. So instead of wondering if this is the day that the shoes go out the window and the plant comes down and whatever, to have that child be closer to you with a task, or especially with acknowledging to them what you see them doing that's working, to see if that could potentially be that hook. Because I think that naturally I would normally ask, well, what's happening when that 0 to 60 happens? What am I missing? Right? Like what is their need? What are they missing? The things that we've been talking about, but maybe going in the other way. And then that way you can monitor a little bit more closely, because then you have them busy, you have them engaged, you have them acknowledged. Just an idea. I don't know if that makes sense as something to try. And then the other things depends on the kiddo around, what was your plan when you knocked over that plant, or what were you hoping, and trying to communicate with them. Now that the plant's on the ground, we can't go outside. I just wonder what those conversations are like. And it sounds like you're probably not getting a lot.
Yeah, it's some kind of an out of body experience.
Got it.
And so there's not a lot of processing that can happen in the moment.
Got it.
But definitely returning once everything is kind of de-escalated.
Right.
Returning to that conversation, and they speak very eloquently about their behavior at that point.
once it's done.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
it is
Okay.
much to- So yeah, I'm still working on it. I'll let you know how.
Yeah, please do, because I'd love to hear
Got
back,
another year.
especially from, yeah, from the specialist about what they might, you know, what they might offer and things that you're trying.
Yeah.
Other things that folks are kind of wrestling with right now that they're thinking about that they've had.
We have
Yep.
So you can decide if you want to keep this open Q&A or if you
Yep.
want to share any more.
I wanted to just give one more opportunity and then we could touch base quickly on the things in the packet that we haven't talked about yet. Okay. So on page 7 to 9 in the packet and moving into the structures sensory stimulation, this is something that I brought up earlier that we've been talking about, which is that there's some trial and error with individual children, with the classroom environment, with a group, small groups of kids, with the whole community of kids about what works. And that finding what is most calming to each individual child is going to be something that you'll tease out as you have this relationship with the child. I think that I want to, you know, share that I hope we all feel really empowered, that there will be a moment when that one chewy that you offer the kids that have the wood chips in their mouth will become every child's heartfelt desire to have a chewy. And in that moment, it's okay for us to say, not all friends need a chewy. This friend is a vegetarian. They don't have the same meatballs that you have. And Andrew wears glasses, but teacher Leah wears her glasses inside her eyeballs. And not everybody needs glasses. So the idea that each child needs the same thing or each child needs the same thing every time is something that if we let go of that, I think it unburdens us a little bit in terms of finding those ways of doing sensory stimulation. The way that I've grouped some things in this packet is just to give you an idea. I've pulled out these different sensory areas, and in the packet there are longer lists, but the idea being that these are some things that have been mentioned, that we've talked about in scenarios, that we've shared with each other, but also some things hopefully that are new that you might want to try, that are ways of giving that sensory input based on these different sensory systems that could help fulfill these needs and wants of sensory seeking kiddos. So if you want to move forward, Becky, we can look a little bit. So the idea that in your packet, I'm not going to go through all of these because of time, but that there are some things that we may already be doing and that we know are best practices that really serve children. For instance, like visual schedules, that research and experience also shows are particularly effective with sensory seeking children. So this can be a little bit of a cheat sheet if you have a child that you find is very, very tactile, and you've been doing sensory bins and you've been doing sensory toys, but you're looking for things that might be a little bit different. You can pop into this packet and see if there are other things that you're seeing that might work. There are some things that I saw in my research that I found really interesting that are, my idea is it doesn't take special equipment. It's low hanging fruit, meaning it's stuff that's pretty easy to implement that might already be in our setting. An example here, for instance, on oral or tasting is that drinking through a straw or drinking thicker liquids is a way sometimes with sensory seeking children to slow them down. They will get some satisfaction and get the ability to enjoy that and have that as a way of getting sustenance, where if there's a kid that just has a really hard time even slowing down enough to eat or drink. And so some simple things to try might end up working once, twice, or maybe even in a pattern as something that really supports a given kiddo. So this is a way of looking at by sensory system ways of doing stimulation. Something else I want to just point out quickly is that we've talked about knowing ourselves and reflecting on our own biases. And I love that it was mentioned, is a child really disrupting other kids' naps, or are you just saying to yourself, if I hear that child kick their mat one more time, I'm going to have to take a walk around the block. So finding out more about your own relationship to sensory. So there's a self-reflection on sensory processing. Maybe it's a fun thing to do yourself, with a partner, with a friend at the bar or at the coffee shop. And it talks about these different sensory areas, and it's a way of you maybe identifying. And another thing I want to say by way of sort of empowerment and support is that maybe you're not the teacher that works with the kiddo that's the Hummer during snack time. Maybe you're not that person. Maybe you are so awesome at doing the outside tag and wrestling and squashing. And I mean, you could tell I'm very physical, I'm very hyper. So that works for me with the kids that need that. There are other things. I can't stand chalk. Don't like touching it, don't like looking at it, don't like smelling it, don't like anything about chalk. So I'm not the person that's going to be really good about the kid that puts chalk everywhere. So reach out to your colleagues and, talk about how can we work with this? How can we make this happen? And if there's a particularly challenging kiddo that maybe it's not your everyday transition to do with them, maybe you switch it up, because different people have different successes and different skill sets. So again, looking at your own sensory preferences and giving yourself permission to take care of your own sensory needs and to step away from sensory challenges that aren't working for you and therefore aren't going to serve your kids. I will also point out that some of the specifics, particularly these lean a little younger, animal walks, yoga poses, and breathing exercises are in your packet. These are things that I think we often kind of toss out. People say, oh, try breathing with your kid or kids in your class. And that not knowing where to start or not knowing what that means or not really having a structure around it makes it hard. And so rather than having to go out on your own and find it, I put it in this packet as a way of having kids get in their bodies, do movement, do breathing, do things that are connected to their different sensory systems that give them stimulation that's also grounding. So that is in your packet as well. I will conclude by saying that I learn so much every time I do this training, and I really, really appreciate all of the contributions that everybody gave today. I also welcome feedback that anyone has about things they want to know more about, things that could have been different, better, and that I hope that this is the beginning of some really rich conversations that we have with each other as educators at Hilltop and beyond about how to serve sensory children and how we can better embrace just the diversity of how we all experience sensory in the world. So thank you so much. I'm grateful to have this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Thank you to our live stream people for making this our first ever successful live stream event. Woohoo! I think we learned a lot about that process. And we hope to see you all back all over Zoom on July 11th when the wonderful Nico Lees will be presenting on part 2 of this series, where we'll talk about one of the other sensory systems, interoception. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Woohoo! And now snacks.
Snacks.
Snacks. More snacks.
This idea with these little pebbles.
Is that,
Is this you, Becky?
don't you love it?
Brilliant.
Yeah. No, aren't those beautiful?
I'm so happy.
Yeah, 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 yeah.